Now it's time to talk about the equals contract. The very first part of the equals contract is the reflexive property. It basically says that any object is related to itself. So here's Bob. Now, is Bob equal to Bob? That is a true statement. Bob relates to himself because he's Bob. Therefore, Bob should equal Bob. So the first part is the reflexive property. The second part of the equals contract is the symmetric property. The symmetric property says if a first object relates to a second object, then the second object relates to the first. And so, here is the question. Here's Sue, and we're going to say that Bob is equal to Sue. These objects have an equivalence relation. Bob being the first object relates to Sue being the second object. So the symmetric property therefore says that if I interchange Sue and Bob, the equivalence relation remains. Sue is equal to Bob, just as Bob is equal to Sue. The third part of the equals contract is the transitive property. If a first object relates to a second, and that second object relates to a third, then the first must also relate to the third. So in other words, here Bob is equal to Sue. And we find out that Sue is also equal to Tom. Therefore, by the transitive property, Bob must be related to Tom. That is the third property of the equals contract. The fourth part of the equals contract can be potentially confusing, but it's not a hard concept at all. It basically says for multiple invocations of the equals method, the truth results are consistent. So invocation means to invoke the method. So let's say the Bob object invokes the equals method on Sue, and let's say that this value turns out to be false. Now, the code produces the false value. The object Sue then goes along her merry way. The code continues to run. But then later in the code, or at a different segment, the object Sue is again compared with object Bob. No matter how many times you invoke the Bob.equals_Sue invocation of the equals method, you should always have the consistent return value of false because originally Bob.equals_Sue was false. So when it says for multiple invocations of the equals method the truth results are consistent, that doesn't mean that you should get a true value. That just means that the truth value, now what is a truth value? A truth value is a value that is either true or false, and that as many times as you continue to invoke Bob.equals_Sue, that should always turn out to be the result that it was originally. Let's say, for example, let's take Sue out of this and let's put Tom in. And now let's change the truth value. We make it true. And so we evaluate Bob.equals_Tom. We find out that it's true. And so the object Tom goes along his merry way. Later on in the code, we make another invocation of the equals method and return Tom. We want to compare if Bob is equal to Tom, but for some strange reason, upon this second invocation, we get false. This would be a violation of the contract, meaning that it's no longer consistent. Bob no longer is equal to Tom. Now that doesn't mean that Tom can't change value, but what that means is no matter how many times you invoke the equals method consistently within a line of code, it should be consistent with the truth value that it returns. We are assuming something very special here though. We're assuming, of course, that when Tom goes along his merry way, the values that are located in object Tom are not modified. That is where the argument hinges. So if Tom goes along his merry way and then returns, and his values have not been modified, it should still continually be returning the value of true. But consistency has not been violated if Tom goes along his merry way, and then somewhere in the process his values are changed inside the object Tom, and then he returns, and then all of a sudden the equals method returns false. That is not a violation of consistency. So again, implicit in the understanding of consistency means that as long as the object values don't change, the equals method should return a consistent truth value. That's the idea behind consistency. Even though I don't have an exact name for it, I'll call it the not null property. This is the fifth and final property of the equals contract. It says for any non-null reference, the invocation object.equals null should always return false. In other words, here's Reggie. Reggie represents a null object containing no value. Here's Bob, and we're assuming that Bob is not null. Therefore, can Bob equal a null object? No, it can't happen. This should always return false. These are the basic 5 fundamental components of the equals contract. And they are vital to know if you're going to override the equals method successfully.